So here's the hook. DevSecOps is failing in regulated environments because too many folks don't know the rules. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of what those rules are and how we can take it to the next level. We're going to talk about continuous compliance, deep traceability, and ultimately how you can provide the assurance to your stakeholders so you can continue at pace. I'm Aubrey Stern, and let's put the T in CTO. I've seen DevSecOps movements become incredible enablers, helping to transform how people build, deploy, and operate software. Conversely, I've seen it fail, and I've heard the same war stories from people time and time again. So I really want to track it back and suggest how we can take things to the next level. Today we're going to talk about a really specific kind of regulated environment. Those firms are known as CAS firms, or firms that are subject to the Client Asset Sourcebook. If you're subject to the Client Asset Sourcebook, you're more than likely going to be an SMCR firm as well. SMCR stands for Senior Management Certification Regime. Now, those two acronyms are going to be probably very foreign for a lot of technologists in the UK, and that's kind of the problem. In order to understand how to go faster in regulated environments, we first need to understand the rules of the game.
Rule 1 of any game or con. You can only get smarter by playing a smarter opponent.
Government, finance, and defense are all heavily regulated, and DevSecOps works so fantastically in so many other businesses. But the model isn't set up for the last mile hurdles of regulated firms, internal and external audits. So let's start with who sets the rules. We have the EBA, the PRA, and the FCA. Now I'm just going to go into a very quick side note around Basel. In 1988, the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision passed a set of international regulatory rules and guidelines. These are used to regulate a bank's capital requirements. This is known as Basel I. In 2004, it was reformed. It introduced 3 pillars of measurement, and this is known as Basel II. Finally, in 2010, Basel III was introduced as a response to the subprime mortgage financial crisis. It introduced additional capital requirements with the hope of avoiding further bank bailouts. So now we're going to talk about one of the big players, the EBA. The EBA contribute 2 really big things that are important for the context of this video. First up is the EBA guidelines on outsourcing, which gives us a really nice segue into critical and important functions, but let's park that for the moment. In short, the first outsourcing guidance was issued in 2006, but it wasn't updated until 2019 with cloud-specific guidance. Now, the guidance issued by CEBS, which is the Committee of European Banking Supervisors, covers a wide range of entities. And those are anything inside the EBA scope, including credit committees, payment institutions, electronic money institutions, or investment firms that are subject to CRD or the Capital Requirements Directive, which is our next important contribution. CRD is a little bit like a movie franchise. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 of them now. Between 2000 and 2013, these legislative packages were issued. Without making this a lengthy video, these packages contain ever more current capital requirements standards. Now, as we mentioned, Basel III was a response to the subprime mortgage financial crisis, and CRD4, with a degree of flexibility, packages those changes into EBA directives. Now, somewhere between Basel II, Basel III, CRD3 and CRD4, there was an introduction of something called an MRT, or Material Risk Taker, or I should say identification of. These folks are also known as coded staff or code staff. Now, a Material Risk Taker is somebody that has influence over the firm's risk profile or performance. And just to explain a tiny bit more about MRTs, hey folks, future Aubrey here, and past Aubrey was about to go and tell you a bunch of stuff that basically wasn't true. So I'm jumping in just with a few key points around material risk takers. Now, firms can be broken up into different tiers, and different tiers have different rules applied to them. An example of this is that code employees at tier 1 firms are subject to a bonus cap of 100% of their fixed remuneration. You can go to 200%, but you'd have to get the okay from the EBA first. Now, if you work at a tier 1 firm, a proportion of your variable remuneration has to be in linked instruments to the firm, and it also needs to be deferred. However, if you work for a tier 3 firm, it is appropriate to disapply a lot of the remuneration code in regards to material risk takers. This means that bonuses don't have to be capped, they don't need to be deferred over a number of years, and they don't have to be subject to malus and clawbacks. There also doesn't need to be a ratio between fixed and variable remuneration. Finally, there's no need for that variable remuneration to be awarded in equity instruments. So even after a material risk taker leaves an organization, they can still be subject to malus and clawback, which means if we made a mistake, if there was something bad about the code that we wrote, if there was a mistake that led to a security breach and we leaked customer data, they would be the people responsible for that. And that's where the buck stops. This is why it's so important that we're able to provide the right kind of insurance to second line and the right kind of evidence to audit that we have met those controls with suitable guardrails. Okay, let's get back to the main video. Essentially, if something goes horribly wrong or someone's on the hook for something being done the wrong way, these are the people that go to prison. Because they're so financially handcuffed to the organization, they provide the perfect counterbalance for risk-taking. As a small aside, it was only in June 2020 when the EBA finalized the standards for MRT identification. Okay, so far we've learned about Basel, Capital Requirements Directives, and the EBA. I hope you're still with me. We've only got 2 more to go, and then we're going to take it to the next level with something technical. So next up, we have the PRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority. The PRA supervises around 1,500 firms, from investment banks, normal banks, building societies, through to insurers. They regulate products and financial services offered by the aforementioned firm types. The PRA provide tailored supervision to each of these firms, as well as help to develop strategies that build resilience during a financial crisis. This is in addition to also providing stress test scenarios. Finally, they look at continuity of our financial system should a failure occur. The idea being that if it does happen, that it happens in a truly British and orderly way. Stiff upper lip, old boy. Okay, so we've learnt about the PRA and we kind of know roughly what they do, and now we're into the last mile, I promise. This brings us all the way to the FCA, or the Financial Conduct Authority. Now the FCA regulate the financial services industry just like the PRA, except they play a more consumer-weighted role. Their aim is to keep the industry stable while promoting healthy competition. Both the FCA and the PRA have their own rulebooks/handbooks. And if we look at the PRA, you will find guidance around the size of the firm that you are and the kind of regulation that applies to your firm based on size and risk and capital exposure. At the FCA, we find their handbook, and in that handbook, we'll find source books for the type of services or products that we're offering. For example, you might find the CONC, or the Consumer Credit Handbook. You can also find the MCOB, or the Mortgages and Home Finance Conduct of Business, BIPRU, or the Prudential Sourcebook for Banks, Building Societies and Investment Firms, and then the SYSC, or the Senior Management Arrangements, Systems and Controls. So just to track this back to technology, if you're working in finance, and for example, if you're doing any sort of consumer lending, you'll be subject to the 1974 Consumer Credit Act. You're also going to be subject to the CONC. And as you can imagine, when we look at the technology that we're building, traceability is so important to track back where we implemented code that matches these rules. So imagine this, you're working for a business unit and you're building something to do with consumer credit. You're subject to the 1974 Consumer Credit Act. You're also subject to the CONC sourcebook from the FCA. Somewhere in that business unit will be a material risk taker, and they're going to want assurance that you have followed and implemented all of the rules, and they are not going to be exposed to any negative consequences for things being missed or not implemented. Remember, they're financially handcuffed to the things that you are doing. So, let's talk about risk defense against the dark arts. And like everything before this, I'm skimming because of time constraints. Most organizations are going to implement what's called the 3 lines of risk defense, and I'm going to quickly explain what that means. So the first line of risk defense is us on the ground, operational management. We have ownership, responsibility, and accountability for assessing and mitigating risks, as well as identifying policy control gaps and suggesting remediation. I wonder how many engineers know they're the first line of defense or even know their responsibilities. The second line of defense is formed of multiple components of internal governance. such as compliance, risk management, quality, IT, and other control functions. This line monitors and facilitates the implementation of risk management by operational risk. First line. Next up is third line, internal audit. These folks provide assurance to ExCo, the board, and senior management. They cover how effectively an organization assesses and manages risk. This also includes the effectiveness of second line. So let's say we need to audit a digital platform going live. How many third line capabilities do you think have the technical capability to assess whether we've implemented the right controls or effective controls for managing cloud-based risk, specifically in a shared security model? And this is where the colloquial fourth line of defense comes in, external audit. And for any of the pillar banks, this is likely going to be one of the big four who do your audit. Folks, we're into the second half now, so I hope you have a light touch understanding of the lines of defense involved in risk and the organizations involved in regulating financial services institutes in both the UK and at a European level. So most organizations will have some kind of control framework to capture all of these controls and risks. COSO is a really popular framework, but today we're going to focus on something very cloud specific, the Cloud Security Alliance Cloud Controls Matrix, or we could just say the CSA CCM. Now, this is a really great starting point as a framework, and I love that it's free. I feel like it's missing one thing, which is the articulation of risk and then the control, but it's free, and who are we to argue? Normally, when we look at these frameworks, we would expect to find a risk, which is something that hasn't happened yet, but could happen and would have negative consequences. The control, which is a really broad directive level way of articulating what we should do to try and mitigate that risk. And then finally, the guardrail. And the guardrail is more like the regulation. It's the actual implementation, the thing that we've built to go and meet that control. What I love about these frameworks is they're so much more accessible than a list of NFRs in Excel or a Word document, or even worse, a PowerPoint hiding somewhere in SharePoint that we don't have access to. So let's quickly summarize something. We're not super great at telling our engineers that they're the first line of defense. We don't always articulate the kind of controls that they should be trying to implement as guardrails. And when we do give them those controls, sometimes they're not in a control format, or they're in a very unconsumable format, like NFRs in an Excel spreadsheet. So how can we be better, and how can we take this to the next level? We already have this beautiful notation of risk controls to guardrails. We can have many component guardrails that form a whole guardrail that track back to the control.
Okay, so this is the really exciting technology part I've been dying to tell you about, and I'm going to explain kind of how it works really quickly. What we're going to do is take a block of code and relate that back to an individual control. And here I've just got some Terraform that I've chosen as an example, and we've got this security group that we've defined as a resource, and we can just see there that we've got that audit IVS 01 tag in there, and that's the kind of the piece that helps us to understand that this is related to a particular control. Now, it's not just Terraform that this supports. You can actually tag pretty much any language. When I started, it was just Terraform and it was an AST. And then Louis Pilfold helped me to write a lexical parser, and it supports, I think, 58 different languages now. Louis, if you don't know, is the creator of Gleam, the programming language. So what's happening here is we're just uploading the results of the scan into Undercoat. And so what's happened is it's taken the entire repository, pulled out all of the individual tags and blocks of code that have been tagged, and then pushed them to the Undercoat service for indexing. So the next stage of this is to open the Undercoat front end and to look at all of the controls and all of the guardrails that we've just indexed. I'm going to apologize for the speed of the front end loading. It's a little bit slow the first time you start this, and it's obviously React in dev mode, so it's just going to take some time to compile everything. But once this loads, I'll sort of walk you through roughly how the front end currently looks and why it looks that way. Here we go. So initially we can see sort of the guardrail coverage of all of the projects that I've got running in Undercoat, and you can sort of see at the top I can select individual projects and look at activity and contributions. You can see that I've committed code that has increased the guardrail coverage. I'm going to go and look into this framework section, and that has the Cloud Controls Matrix as well as some rebase where I've sort of taken that and added my own controls to that and my own risks, and I've also like distilled it and removed some things that probably weren't so relevant to my organization. So it gives you an idea of the kind of frameworks that can be selected in an organization. We're going to dive into projects, and we're just going to select the digital platform. We could select something else, but the digital platform is the one that I'm playing with the most at the moment. And again, this is not completely baked, so I'm really still playing around with the UI, but it gives you an idea of sort of like under a project, you can have many linked repositories and sort of see the build status and what was linked to it, team members, and then the guardrails. And this is the most exciting part for me. This is a list of, or will be a list of, all of the guardrails in a particular framework that covers that project. Now we're going to go ahead and jump into this control and have a look at what's inside. And so first of all, we can see the explanation about the risk and the control itself and some other linked artifacts. We can see something called a gov file, which I'll come on to in a second. And then we're also going to look at the evidence. So we can see that we have that code block from Terraform that's been tagged, and we can see that's rolled up and indexed. We also got this insight here that says, because we know it's Terraform, we know it's AWS, we understand the code block that says there's an AWS provider. So we have that deep insight into the code and the type of code itself. But the gov file is what's really important here. And I think if you've ever been through one of these audits, what's really apparent is that there's a really big human side to this. There's providing evidence, and there's also explaining that evidence and really bringing it to life. Like, what were we thinking, and how did we get to this point where we thought this was the right guardrail to meet the control? And what I really wanted to do is create a solution that kept that explanation next to the source code, just like we do with the tags, just like we do with every other part of the solution, so it's codified. And what's really great about Undercoat is that it brings all of these things together. And if you work in engineering, if you work in risk, if you work in audit, looking at the control in this format makes a ton of sense. And we can go even further than this. We can start to add time controls around these guardrails to say that this guardrail should exist to a certain point in time, and now it's a candidate to be removed from source control, and other really cool, interesting things. But again, this is a super simple solution to really take it to the next level in regulated environments.
Finally, there's an even better if. We can make this even easier if you're looking at the code. By using this really quick Undercoat extension, we can do even more. Whenever the extension detects an Undercoat tag in code, it's going to give you the option of using a code lens to provide even more detail on that tag, which means you're going to see the other guardrail components that are associated with it, as well as the risk and the control itself. With these three parts of the solution combined, even if you don't tag your code before you do your first audit, by using these three pillars of the solution, you're going to be engaged with second line risk for the duration of your initiative, and your audits are going to be cheaper and faster. And when you do have remediations to make, that Delta audit is also going to be cheaper and faster, and it will contain just the detail of the things that have actually changed. Now, we're looking at this at a micro level, but if we go up to a macro level, we can provide second line risk and really any other part of the organization with what I call a panoramic view of engineering. So for all of the folks that are engaged with engineering endeavors and folks that are actually using and applying that controls framework, you will be able to see the amount of coverage that they have, what guardrails have actually been implemented, and also allow folks from different initiatives to look at how other initiatives have implemented those controls. So it promotes cross-learning and sharing between teams. Here are my final thoughts. Now that you understand all of the players and the regulations, where they come from, the concept of MRTs, capital requirements directives, you can understand how the counterweight works in an organization to prevent too much risk being taken on. What we need to do is just provide assurance to second, third, fourth line that we are correctly implementing the guardrails to mitigate the risk that exists by meeting the control. If we can do that, and we have proof and we have evidence and we have continuous compliance, it's going to be so much easier for a material risk taker to accept that risk and let us continue moving forward. In summary, going fast is easy, but staying fast and finishing fast is hard. we need to learn to respect the dragon's tail that lives beyond the technical implementation. So if you're smart, it's all to play for, and now you know the rule. I hope you've enjoyed this video. There's a serious chance that I've made some mistakes in it. Like all of you, I'm still learning and growing and trying to get better. Let me know your thoughts and if you're interested in the Undercoat project, and stay awesome and keep pushing those boundaries. If at any point in the future you're in doubt around who's on the hook for the things that we're doing in an organization, I've made a small music video to help you remember. I hope you enjoy it.
They on the hook, yo. They on the hook, yo.